Hi, my name is Brent Wilson. I'm going to talk about the conditions the soldiers faced living in the trenches during the First World War. The trenches are one of the best known features of the First World War, the Great War, as it was called at the time. Between early 1915 and early 1918, so about 3 years in the middle years of the war, soldiers lived and fought in trenches in France and in Belgium. Soldiers' lives, their routines revolved around service in the trenches. During a typical month when there wasn't a big battle on, the troops spent about a week serving in the front line trenches, the kinds of trenches we're in right now. Then the next 2 weeks in the reserve and support trenches further to the rear. And then they get a week out of the line where they could rest up before the whole routine started again. Now, one of the main features of the soldiers who lived in the trenches as well as fought in the trenches was a dugout, which we're in right now. The dugout was built about 2 meters below ground. So if this was an authentic dugout, the top of the trench would be over our heads and we would be several feet down inside the trench. Typically, they had bunk beds, such as we see here, where the soldiers would sleep. They also ate in the trenches. If they were lucky, they had tables and chairs, such as we see in this one. And in some of the trenches, especially officers' trenches, they also had wood stoves for heat, especially during the winter. There were no bathrooms in the dugouts. The latrines, as the Army called them, were at the back of the trenches. So if you needed to go while you were in the dugout, they had something called a thunderbox, which is essentially a porta potty that the soldier would use while he was in the dugout. So you can see there's not much privacy, and as you can imagine, the trenches smell pretty bad. Other hardships that they faced especially came during the winter time, when in France and Belgium where they were fighting, they got a lot of rain. Oftentimes the trenches collapsed, they flooded. The soldiers would have to spend a lot of time bailing out the water, building up the trenches so that they were usable when they went into action against the enemy. Another problem they had was that there was very little clean water, so that they couldn't wash very often. As a result, they got really dirty, both them and their uniforms. And unfortunately for a lot of these soldiers, they became infested with lice. Lice are small insects that crawl around on your body, especially in your hair. They bite you. They build nests inside the seams of your uniform. Pretty unpleasant. The lice would bite the soldiers. They'd get very itchy as a result. And in the worst cases, they could become infected. And so the soldiers had to spend a lot of time trying to get rid of the lice. When they had some spare time, typically they would sit around with their fellow soldiers. They had a candle, and they would pick the lice off their uniforms and burn them to kill them in the candles. The soldiers called this a chatting session because they sat around and they chatted amongst themselves about home and how things were going during the war while they were getting rid of all of their lice. Another problem that arose because of all of the water that was in the trenches, especially in the wintertime, was something known as trench foot. It was a condition that arose as having their feet immersed in the water for long periods of time, which led to open sores developing on their feet and lower legs. Again, because it was so dirty, there was a chance that their sores could become infected, sometimes quite seriously infected. If it got really bad, it would require the amputation or the removal of their toes or lower legs in order to prevent the spread of a serious condition called gangrene, which, if it spread too far, could kill the soldier. Another problem that the soldiers had to contend with was the presence of thousands of rats. Rats invaded the trenches in very large numbers. They became quite large. Some Canadian soldiers described them as being the size of cats. And the soldiers really hated them. The rats ate their food. They sometimes ate their boots or their leather belts and so forth. And so the soldiers spent a lot of time trying to get rid of them. One of the things they also did to try to get rid of the rats was to keep dogs in the front lines. Both to deal with the rats as well as pets. Having dogs around would remind them of what it was like to be back home. You have to remember that a lot of these soldiers were quite young. Many of them were teenagers, probably not a lot older than some of you. Over here's a photograph of my grandfather, who was a soldier in the First World War. He was 19 when he joined up. So they were pretty young, and most of them were away from home for the first time. They'd been living at home when they joined up. So this was a completely new experience for them. One of the concerns the Army had was to keep up the morale of these soldiers under these very difficult conditions. Morale is mental toughness, I guess you would say, to try to make sure that they didn't become depressed or sad or lose their spirit, I guess you would say. And they did a lot of things the Army did a lot of things to try to keep the morale of the soldiers high. They made sure that letters from home were sent to the soldiers, as well as the letters that they wrote home. There was a lot of comradeship amongst the soldiers. The soldiers were each other's best friends while they were at the front. They knew they could rely on one another, and they knew they could draw strength when times got tough from their fellow soldiers. Even when they were behind the lines, the Army took measures to try to promote this sense of comradeship. They relied a lot on sports to keep up their spirit. Sports produced teamwork as well as an ongoing sense of comradeship. So there were a lot of challenges soldiers had to face just living in the trenches, and they spent probably more time just trying to make do than they did actually fighting the enemy. So it was an ongoing battle for them, just trying to keep their spirits up. So this is a quick capsule summary of what conditions were like in the trenches. I hope you have time to do more research. You might find some projects to interest you. Some of you might want to write letters like you would to a soldier at the front, telling them what their who you were, and try to get a sense of their lives in a return letter from them. So good luck with your research.